was 5 years old, my family volunteered to help out someone by fixing something on their sailboat. Who they were, what it was, I don't remember. I was 5. But as my parents were helping these strangers out, I was hanging out below decks, spending time with the girlfriends, the wives, I don't even remember at this point, but I was primly perched on some sort of Chesterfield, and I had all of them enraptured with the story of my parents and my trip to Egypt.
Egypt?
They couldn't look away. They were just sitting there enraptured by my 5-year-old self, just telling them this magnificent story about our trip to Egypt. And by the time my parents had finished fixing whatever they were fixing, they came down to collect their child, and these women were gushing about how beautiful this trip to Egypt must have been, how lucky we were. My mother sighed and said, "We've never been to Egypt. We have never been to Egypt."
I thought so.
And this is when my parents realized they had a problem on their hands. I was a storyteller. To the extent that I had a hard time figuring out the difference between fantasy and reality. For the first few years in my life, I got in trouble constantly. People thought I was lying. And I don't blame them. Telling stories about a place I'd never ever been to. But as far as I knew, I wasn't lying, I was telling the truth. But it wasn't the truth, it was my truth. It was the truth that was inside my head. It wasn't the truth, but I thought it was. And I didn't know how to explain that. Fortunately, my parents are wonderful, and my mother immediately picked up on what was happening. And we came up with a code word when I lived in Paris. Sorry, I'm getting emotional. When I lived in Paris was the first story I had ever told my family. I was living at the top of the Eiffel Tower with my 20 children, good Lord, my 20 pets, and my 20 cell phones. Don't know why that was a detail, but it was. I would constantly tell these stories, especially when my mother was trying to parent me. I would always say, when I was a mother, I did this. It got to the extent that my mom and my dad were wondering, is she remembering her past life? What's going on here? But it was a wonderful way for my parents and me to figure out when I wasn't telling the truth. I don't know why I'm getting emotional.
Keep going, it's good. Keep going, I'm fascinated.
Those 5 little words, just to prepare them. But while my parents were wonderful and understood me, that doesn't mean the rest of the world did.
I'm sure.
It got to the extent that, I don't know why I'm emotional. It got to the extent that my school system wanted to label me as ADHD so that they would get money for me. And my parents fought. They fought with tooth and nail, and eventually there was a talk that they all had with a counselor. And that talk ended with the counselor saying she's smart, she's bored, and she needs something to do.
That's all.
And my parents turned to the principal and said, "What are you going to do about it?" And my second grade teacher stepped up. Her name was Madame Stewart. I was in French immersion. And one of the details I remember was her husband was the mayor of Coquitlam. And I loved her more than I loved her husband. Madame Stewart was very similar to my mother because she saw through what was happening and stepped up to help. And she introduced me to the arts. She taught me how to write in English because I was in French immersion. She did her best to teach me how to draw, even though I can't to this day. And she taught me how to perform through words. So both my parents and Madame Stewart helped me figure out my love for creative writing. And we found out it was a wonderful way to channel my creativity into something that would help me deal with everyday life. By the time I had reached 5th grade, I published my first book. We had found a program that taught children how to write, and I published my first book. A year later, I published my second, and the year after that, I published my third. The more I wrote, the easier it was to figure out what was real and what wasn't. The more I wrote, the more my creativity could run wild in a safe space. And the more I wrote, the better I could deal with everything. If it weren't for the people in my life, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here at Douglas studying creative writing. If it weren't for people encouraging me, I would be a husk of who I am now. I would be an empty shell with no purpose in life. And nowadays, I can very easily differentiate fantasy and reality because I now have a safe space to transfer fantasy into. And thanks to that, I have 3 published books under my belt and many more still in my head. And I hope you will all take this story and understand that there is a safe way to express yourselves. And I hope dearly that you will find it. Thank you.